Welcome. So tonight is the third webinar that we've done as part of TRAC, Trauma Response and Crisis Care for Movement's COVID Care Response and Support. So this will be the third. We have another two upcoming that I'll also mention. The end of our time together that'll be coming next week and the week after. But this one this week, we talked about trauma week 1. We talked about the things that shift in crisis during the second webinar. Both of those are also available via YouTube. At the end, I'm going to give you the information for my link tree, where you'll be able to find all kinds of information for TRAC and also for myself. That'll be just kind of an easy reference point to grab everything, including the other webinar registrations for stuff that's upcoming. But as we're moving into the weeks of this experience and this crisis and this collective sort of rising sense, not just of the trauma, but the heaviness of the moment, it felt like a time and place to talk a little bit more intentionally about grief. And so this particular webinar is how do we hold grief of the moment, and how do we honor, understand, hold the grief for ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities. That's a tall order. By no means am I going to have the be-all, end-all answers to everything. But as somebody with a background and lineage of both studying sort of spiritual lineages and traditions, as well as therapeutic and healing and wellness lineages and traditions around how we hold grief, I wanted to come into this space to be able to offer some hopefully useful information that's helpful to frame what grief looks like in general and what grief looks like in this moment, and maybe kind of frame out why it's so specifically heavy in the now. And then hopefully also open it up for space and dialogue for us to talk about the nature of holding grief for ourselves and our communities in this moment. But as I start everything this way, I want to open up the space initially with a practice, and also giving a kind of frame and a holding space that in this place and space that we're sharing together right now, that ideally as a community for this time that we're sharing together, that we can have a shared agreement about holding protected space. When we talk about hard things, when we talk about vulnerable and delicate things like trauma, like crisis, like grief, they can open up parts of ourselves. And likely in this moment, many of those parts and pieces are already exposed in some way, shape, or form. So we want to find a way to not necessarily create safety, because as we're all aware in this moment, safety is not a guaranteed phenomenon. We cannot guarantee that, but we can guarantee protection. And what that means is protection for ourselves, for those delicate and vulnerable parts of ourselves in this moment, and also again in this shared time and space, a way of holding that protection for each other in the way that we are just present with each other, and also in the moments in which we're being dialogue and in connection with each other, a way that we are being gentle and generous, which is a phrase I keep using throughout this crisis period. What are the ways we can be gentle and generous with ourselves and with each other? So I just offer that up as a framework of how we can hold space for ourselves and each other in this moment. And just an acknowledgement that whenever we talk about stress, distress, crisis, trauma, grief, that it can and essentially will pull up things in ourselves from now, from the past. And so just be aware and attuned of what you can hold, and feel free to do what you need to do even throughout this time. So if that means pause, take a time out, take a deep breath, do whatever you need to do. And hopefully this opening will allow us a moment to kind of just breathe and ground where we are right now together. So wherever you are in your life, in your home space, wherever that is, allow yourself to just get as comfortable as possible wherever you're sitting, or maybe you're laying down. Allow yourself to feel grounded in some way, shape, or form, even if that's just noticing the chair that's holding you up, or the couch that's holding you up, or the floor that's holding you up. Just being aware at a body level in some way, shape, or form of the tactile nature of what is surrounding you. So maybe it's the hardness of a chair or the softness of rug underneath your feet. Whatever it is, just begin to ground yourself in this moment with that tactile sensory experience of what is grounding you, literally the floor, literally the chair or the couch. And then if it's comfortable for you, you can gently close your eyes. If it's not comfortable to close your eyes, just find something to look at that isn't going to distract you, possibly on the floor or somewhere below your main sight line. And then bring your attention in on your breath. Breath is always a critical place of our stress or de-stressing in our body and in turn in our mind. But most especially in this moment where we find our lives so surrounded with the function of breathing, with the necessity of breathing, with the clearness of breathing. Let's hold in this moment the ability to ground in our breath. And luckily we have distractible noises around us to remind us that there's always distractions in life, and offers us an opportunity to turn back and center in that space inside us where we hold our own breath. So just notice for a moment the rhythm and the pace of your own breathing. Notice the length of your inhales, the length of your exhales. Noticing the pace and rhythm of breath moving through your lungs, through your body. And then on your next inhale, take a deep breath in. Imagine filling your lungs up with air like a balloon. And on your exhale, release that oxygen out, pulling your belly in towards your spine, wringing out all the air. On your next inhale, breathing in deeply and completely, filling your lungs up with air like a balloon. And on your exhale, release and let go. Maybe relaxing a little tension in your body or your mind on the exhale. And creating your own slow and steady rhythm of breath, allowing yourself to pay attention to the fullness of your inhales, the oxygenation of your body, and the fullness of your exhales, releasing and letting go, letting go, letting go. And as you move into your own slow and steady rhythm of breath, let us also acknowledge the fact that we can't let go of everything, that there are things that are heavy, that are holding on. So without judgment and without criticism, let's just acknowledge those parts where we're holding heaviness, maybe in the center of our chest or in our gut. Notice where you feel that concentration, whatever it is that might be burdening you in this moment, that may feel too heavy to let go of right now, without judgment or without criticism of the fact that it won't or it can't release in this moment. Just acknowledge its presence with gentleness and with generosity. Imagine yourself holding it inside your body, maybe in a different way, in a nurturing way, in a kind way. Being aware of the presence of whatever feels most heavy in this moment for you. And on your next inhale, imagine breathing into that space of heaviness without needing to change anything, just breathing into and acknowledging that space. And on your exhale, take a big, deep sigh and release. Allowing the oxygen to release. Allowing yourself to hold that gentleness for what remains. On your inhale, take another big, deep breath in, breathing deeply into that place where the heaviness is stored most obviously in your body. And on your exhale, sigh and release. Holding space for what needs to remain right now. One more big, deep breath in, breathing into that place of heaviness. And another big deep exhale out. Acknowledging where the heaviness is held, releasing any judgment for yourself or for that tender place that needs to hold whatever feels heavy right now. And then slowly and gently, as you're ready, bring some energy back into the muscles of your body, maybe wiggling your fingers or your toes, maybe shaking your head gently from side to side. And then as you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes. If they were closed, if they weren't closed, just allow yourself to recenter back into the space. Just with acknowledgement and awareness of whatever is present in this moment, whatever is rising up. Again, without judgment or criticism, just noticing what's there. And I keep using the language of gentleness and generosity for ourselves and outwardly for others, but sometimes we forget it for ourselves, even when we're offering it out to others right now, wherever we are, because there is a heaviness in all of us that's holding on in some way, shape, or form, and what that is exactly, how it's manifesting, where the roots of it are, may be slightly different based on all kinds of lived circumstances of where we are physically, socioeconomically, based on all kinds of factors in our life right now. But there's a collective heaviness that we're holding through our different various perspectives in this moment. And so being gentle and generous to acknowledge that it's there, to not necessarily try to fight against it or oppress it within our own systems, but allowing it to be present, allowing us to be aware of its presence, and just to acknowledge it and acknowledge what needs to remain and what can be released in any given moment can be a helpful practice as we move through our days in this crisis, in this pandemic moment, to, unlike many other times where oftentimes there's things maybe that we can release in any given moment, there's a kind of heaviness right now that means that things may need to hang on. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of the sort of view of grief and loss in this moment, and specific ways and reasons also to kind of talk about why things are holding on stronger right now and why things are heavier right now. And then we'll also have some time for conversation as we move through. But I want to just talk specific to this moment about framing grief and trauma in the crisis that we find ourselves in, where we're in a landscape where so much is happening so quickly, so much that is fueled by the COVID-19 virus, but also the socioeconomic impact on so many people in this moment. We have this sort of world-changing framework, world-changing view, in which whatever was true about our lives for all of us in some way, shape, or form 3 months ago is no longer true about our lives. What was true about the world that we knew 3 months ago is no longer true in some way, shape, or form into the world and the life that we're living into now. And in one of the earlier webinars, I talked about this sense of moral injury or sense of kind of betrayal that we can feel with a world that no longer meets the criteria for what we had expectations for. And sometimes those can be very big, and sometimes those can be even just the small details of life. The ability to leave a 3-block radius of our house, you know, the expectation of our worldview that should be possible, no longer being a factor of truth in many places for many people. The ability to imagine that I can pay my bills next month when that no longer may be true, a factor for many people. The ability to go into a grocery store, to touch a door handle in a public building and feel a sense of safety, that just that act itself is an okay thing and doesn't hold any danger, no longer gets to be fully true. And so this entire change of world perspective and worldview is something that in and of itself, at whatever level it impacts us individually, is an experience of loss. is something that we have to grieve at some level. The world that we knew, the world that we had an expectation to be preserved in some way, shape, or form, even in the outliers of what we might have expected might go wrong, that this is blown apart even that anticipation or that expectation of what could go wrong. And so at a very basic level, we all are holding a sense of grief and loss. And again, combined with a sense of sort of traumatic inner experience of the fact that the world is not what we expected it to be, what we thought it would be, and in many ways has been disappointing at varying catastrophic levels. So when we think about grief of the moment, we'll talk about the layers of grief in this moment, and there's very acute and personal and intimate layers of grief, but there's also this general overarching nature of grief that we don't really quite know what to do with, and that maybe even if we have rituals and practices and ways in which we grieve specific things in our life that we've tapped into before, that this overarching experience of grief, we don't really have a toolkit, most of us, to address this level of kind of change of life, change of perspective, change of worldview. It feels like a violation to the world that we knew once, and a violation to a kind of silent, invisible trust that we had built with the world that we knew, that it would at least be a certain way within a certain set of parameters. So I want to imagine when we think about what we're holding in the heaviness of that grief and loss of the moment, that at a very basic and in many ways universalizable level, that we're all holding the grief of change, of dramatic and acute and traumatic change in this moment. And so just acknowledging that that is present for all of us in some way, shape, or form is a way to also be able to visualize grief in this moment that's beyond the particular and the personal, that really is a collective experience that we're all feeling at some level. I wanted to speak briefly. So in the sort of psychological language of grief, there's a term that's been used more and more over the last decade that's called complicated grief. And I think that understanding that term a little in this moment is important, in that complicated grief is sort of described as grief that has not had the ability to be processed, grief that comes from sudden traumatic loss that could not be expected, and that doesn't have the space to be processed in the way that you would. So uncomplicated grief, if we want to call it that, again, language, and definitely language within the psychological sphere has massive limitations. But when we talk about uncomplicated grief or normative grief, that's the grief that you experience when, say, somebody has been sick for a long period of time, where all of the loved ones of that person has been able to show up, been able to say everything that they wanted to say, reflect on everything that they wanted to reflect on, have the time and space they needed to process the impending loss of that particular person, and then over a sustained period of time, prepare for the final moments in which that person is leaving your life in this particular way. And so if that sort of healthy for us process of grief allows a whole bunch of things to happen along the way, that lets us acknowledge this is happening, be able to go through the period in which we may have some disbelief around it, but work through it, be able to get to a place in which we know that person is transitioning and potentially aware of that transition that they're going to be going through, in which they have the supportive care and love that they need to move through that process. And so that even when the loss comes, it is painful, it is difficult, and it can take time to move through. But there's a period of preparation for every single person in that process to be able to get there. Complicated grief is the kind of grief in which any part of that process of preparation has been stunted. So if we think about the moment that we're in right now, every part of the process of grief has been stunted for us individually and collectively on a wider scale. The amount of loss of human life alone in this moment is so catastrophic that and in many ways unexpected, in the sense that everything happened so rapidly, that there is no way to have that extended process of understanding, of moving through, of feeling the necessary feelings that you need to feel, have the rituals and spiritual lineage traditions or healing lineage traditions that you need to have to move through the process of loss and transition for say, the loved one or the person in your life. Even the loss of a job in a normative way, right? An uncomplicated version of loss, even in that perspective, is, you know that you're transitioning out of a job, you give 4 weeks notice, you have a process in which you're preparing for the ways in which it will change your life, change your life perspective. You have time to think about it, to talk to others about it. So then when we think about the loss, even when we're not talking about the lives lost, but then we think about the millions and millions of jobs lost, all of those abruptly, all of those in a span of time in which nobody could process the level of intensity of it, whether we're even talking from a systemic level, the systems haven't even been able to process it. And then we think about our internal systems, our communal systems, our family systems being able to process it. So then we look at that in the framework of what we call complicated grief. Everything about this moment is an experience of complicated grief. It is extremely traumatic and abrupt. We had no time to prepare for it. We have no real time to prepare the kinds of processes and rituals that we would want to deal with the grief and to move through the loss and to transition our lives from what was into what could be. And where we're in right now in this sort of continuing crisis moment, what continues to complicate this grief of the moment, and I think also why maybe many of us feel kind of stuckness and an extensive heaviness of the grief of the moment, is that in trauma and crisis, you're in your body, your mind, and also your communities, when it's collective, are in a triage mode, which means what is the thing that is most acutely wrong that we need to make sure is okay in this moment. So for people in financial crisis, who may also be losing loved ones, it may be a matter of how do we make sure that we get food stamps? How do we make sure we get to and from the store once we get the food stamps so that we can get the food that we need without us getting sick? So there isn't time to process even a loved one lost. There isn't time to process even the job that was lost. It's about what is the next immediate thing that has to be done for survival in this triage crisis, traumatized state. You'll see, and maybe you've seen in some of the interviews with folks that are in, that have lived through multiple family members that have passed away. Even the way that they describe it comes from this place of very complicated grief where they say, we literally didn't have the time to even process that our mother had died because then our father was sick and then our sister was sick. And so in this triage framework, the grief is getting stuck because it has to, because essentially it has to take a back seat to whatever is most urgent in the moment. And if the urgent thing in the moment is some kind of survival, whether it's to battle the disease that's within your own body, whether it's to make sure that you have food on the table so that you're not starving, make sure you have housing to make sure that you're some way protected, whatever those things are that are most urgent, are taking sort of priority over the grieving process, which creates an extra layer of complication to this grief, because not only ahead of time was there no time to prepare because everything was so abrupt, but then there also is no time to respond to the grief afterwards because we're not in an after period yet. We're still in a place and state of crisis. Now, again, this may be different depending on where you live and geographic circumstances and the extent to which this has hit and harmed your own personal world sphere. But in some way, shape, or form, we are still in crisis moment collectively. And so that grief is still being held and many times can continue to be compounded because every day there's a new thing to add to it. So whether it's the personal loss of a job or a loved one, or it's the loss that we hear about just in our collective consciousness, it triggers a sense of grief inside us that we don't know what to do with. And oftentimes when it's not direct, we really don't know what to do with it because we've never really talked very well as a culture, as a community, when we think about Western society, as how we collectively grieve in larger and bigger ways. We definitely haven't talked about how we do that during a crisis where we can't even physically touch or be present with other human beings. But we've also never done very well ritualizing collective processes of grief as a larger society. Now we look at smaller communities and different spiritual communities, ethnic communities. There are various practices and principles that we often have from our own living wisdom and our own living traditions, but the larger sphere of the Western world is much more consumed with in many ways, unfortunately, even the news, right, exacerbating the trauma of the moment, compounding the grief of the moment. If you spend even more than an hour a day watching CNN, you can end up in a massive grief spiral just by the nature of the sort of general sensationalization of news. The facts are true, but the inundation with things like numbers that we can't even conceptualize in terms of human life, numbers we can't conceptualize in terms of the loss of of jobs, of employment, of housing, the bombardment of that information at such a level and such a speed that we're sent that information with no way to process it, no way to grieve it, no way to ritualize it, becomes overwhelming very, very quickly, which is also why in this moment, in terms of the traumatic process of grief and the inability to fully process grief in a moment in which you're still in a crisis, it becomes a little bit of a kind of how do you manage the level of input that you're taking, of the level of essentially pain and suffering each day? What are the boundaries that you have to set around yourself and around your own lived experience that allow you to get from one day to the next without being so overwhelmed that you can, and so overconsumed by this level of loss and grief that you can't function? How do you mediate that to a level that it doesn't mean that you're not absorbing information or taking in the reality of this situation, or even doing the things that may be part of your work or part of your own sort of ethos to try to support people or to create change around inequity? But how do you do that in a way in which you can actually get through the moment? What is the way that you triage what your input is? And then the other piece of it is, how do you triage your grief as well? How do you acknowledge the grief that is present, that actually doesn't have space and room to be mourned in its fullness now? And what are the tools, resources, rituals, and practices that you can do that in a small way can take a bite, can take a moment, can take a piece of that grief and allow it space just to breathe and be acknowledged and be recognized in any given day, so that by the time we're a month from now or 2 months from now, that you're not to an explosive level. So it's not built up so much in your system that it feels like it's unbearable, intolerable, unmanageable. But how do you take pieces of it and just be able to have moments where you can pull it out and acknowledge it, resonate with it, maybe cry for it, maybe yell for it, maybe, practice a ritual for it, with the acknowledgement that you're only able to do that in small doses right now while you're still in that triage mode and mindset. So I want to hold that here for a moment and just pause together. Let that sit. I want to talk a little bit in a second about primary and secondary grief and what that means right now. But I'd like to just take 3 deep breaths together. So wherever you are, if you can take a big deep inhale in and a big deep exhale out. Another big deep inhale in. Another big deep exhale out. One more big deep inhale in. And big deep exhale out. And then just notice what is settling or unsettling inside of you in this moment. What is rising up that you're aware of right now? Just pay attention in your body, in your mind. What is becoming most visible or present right now? And then I want to see if folks have, at this point, any questions, reflections, thoughts that you'd like to share. If so, you can feel free to turn your mic on and speak into the space. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can also write something in the chat box and I can share that. Just pause for another moment in case anybody has anything they want to share, or a question or reflection.
Hi, my name is Kaia, and one of the things that I'm thinking about is in myself, I can feel like, I think I'm having some trouble distinguishing what the source of my grief is, because there's the immediate um, circumstances that I found myself in, and of course, the witnessing of others. And there's also, I think, in me connecting to memories of other moments in life where I felt grief, and it's been very complicated. And so, yeah, I just wanted to. I don't know exactly what my question is, but I'm just thinking about the layering and how I might work with that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's part of the complexity of the grief of the moment too. I appreciate how you said, I don't know where to even source where the grief is coming from, right? And that's some of the complexity of this moment, is that the heaviness is just layered on, and it's not like a situation where one singular thing happens and at least you can point that out and you know where your sort of focus is, even for how you want to process, how you want to ritualize, how you want to move through the grief. It's in many ways, because it's so layered and so large, it can feel too big, right? It can feel like it's taking up so much space that you don't even know where to begin, which is also why I think, being able to compartmentalize in the sense that you can take a piece out of something that you're holding just for today, or even just in any given hour, and be able to hold that with a kind of gentleness and generosity. And it may not be a thing, it might just be a sense of feeling. Or even when we did in the initial meditation, the reason why I didn't want to necessarily give that heaviness a name is, again, because maybe it doesn't have a name. Maybe even the feelings are too muddled that it's hard to isolate. And the thing that you're feeling the heaviness from is too hard to isolate because there are too many layers of it. And so sometimes it can be a matter of just honoring the heaviness itself without needing to name it, or even needing to name the feelings associated with it. And again, some of that, when it's given more room to breathe, when we're no longer in a sort of level and state of crisis that's so collective and so large, that there will be more space for it to breathe, and there will be more capacity to pull pieces out and be able to look at them and be able to process them more intentionally. But in this kind of triage state, it may be a matter of just finding ways to ritualize throughout a day or throughout a week. How are the ways that you pause and you just honor and give space to that heaviness, even when you can't name it fully? So I appreciate you reflecting on that. And then I see Preeta also mentioned just reflecting. It is sometimes, I just lost it. It is sometimes a barrier to let out a little grief that will ramp up too fast and too quick. Yeah, and I think that's also, I appreciate you saying that also, Preeta, because I think there are ways in which we have to figure out, that goes back also to our own boundaries. Sometimes the boundaries are with grief itself. So what are the ways in which we set up the boundaries where if something feels too much, that we allow ourselves to put it to the side for this moment. There are some things we can hold and some things that we can't yet hold right now in this place and space that we're in right now. And that is true about just in general in traumatic moments. Often, I think Kaia also spoke to this a little in talking about complicated grief from her past, but the layering can also be not just about everything that's happening right now, but when we're in traumatic moments, it can trigger the memory, the experience, the histories of past grief, past loss, past trauma, sometimes even things that we think we have fully worked through, that we feel more vividly in this moment. And so sometimes you're right, we do have to set up those boundaries around what we're willing to hold today or in this moment, or even in the weeks ahead, and what actually needs to be held inside, kind of protected in that vulnerable place until we have more bandwidth or more room and space to manage it. And then I see Jess saying, I appreciate the language and understanding of complicated and uncomplicated grief. Also appreciate acknowledging titrating the grief, however it looks, so it doesn't build and we explode. Yeah, and again, it's a personal navigation, because, to Preeta's point, there are some things that are in of themselves too explosive. And so we may not be able to touch those things that are most vulnerable in this moment, that it might be a matter of, again, finding a way to just kind of hold the heaviness, hold the intensity, acknowledge its presence, and have some practices that help process at least the stress response in us, right? Through like we did the breathing exercise and just the awareness and attunement exercise at a baseline, those kind of things can at least not let all of those stress hormones, all of those pain, that pain and struggle kind of build up in us, even if we're not necessarily in a place where we can address individual parts of that grief in any one moment right now. Leslie says, I work for NYC DOE, and I'm thinking about how we're thinking about students that are going through this grieving moment or even have no space to grieve because of the many asks that are being asked from them for remote learning. Yeah, I think that education in this moment and supporting students is so complicated. And I know for so many teachers, such a big part of nurturing and supporting students, particularly in communities where folks are more marginalized, where, even just the access to space to breathe, to do homework, let alone breathe to grieve, can be a real difficult task. That the presence of being able to be a living educator in their life, to be able to be in their presence, has such a profound impact on being able to support them in their daily difficulties. So it's very hard to then, how do we conceptualize how you support students in moments in which they're maybe stressed in their communities, maybe stressed in their household. On top of it, as you're saying, then they're being stressed by the nature of what's being asked of them in terms of how do you complete a school year and get a grade for anything in this moment. I know a lot of educators also talking about, how we even grade a student for this last period of the year. It doesn't feel right. And the truth is, I think it is very hard, because when we think about developmental trauma, which is the trauma that happens during childhood, child's body, a child's mind can get very overwhelmed and overconsumed by stress and distress, and they absorb the stress and distress even more at a more attuned level that's in their immediate surroundings. So the stress of their parents, whether it's about money or about family or about illness, they're feeling all of that. And like you said, on top of it, are trying to catch up with learning and education in this completely new format, which for many students may not be even feasible to do based on their living circumstances. So it's very, very hard. And I know teachers are trying to be creative in the ways that they have supportive environments for student, have, student hours and those kind of things. And it's hard, because when we're caregivers and ourselves, it's hard to know that the limitations of what we can offer, that we can only do so much in this moment, and that there's so much about the landscape of children that we can't actually mediate for them right now. We can advocate, but we can't change necessarily the dynamics, which is also some of the grief and loss of this moment as well. That's more of a general grief and loss, is there is so much we cannot change. There's so much that is out of our control in this moment, day to day, increasing information about all the things that we can't control. So there's also a loss and grief of time with those students, the loss and grief of being able to nurture them in the ways that you want to, the loss and grief of not being able to change systematic natures of things, even when you're advocating for them. And then I see Michelle said yes to the above comments, especially when you're looking ahead, there's more loss and grief to come for weeks or months. Yes, and understanding and looking at and regulating time right now for ourselves is also a big thing. When we're in states of stress and distress, we cannot try to think too far ahead. I mean, again, this is why news cycles can be really detrimental to our own wellness and our own grounding, is because you listen to a news cycle and every other thing is, tell us about 6 months from now. There's the vaccine isn't gonna be for 2 years. No one's gonna be able to leave their house until 2022. You know what I mean? Like, it so quickly gets exacerbated that we can spin out with the level of stress and distress. The numbers of people that are gonna get ill that are estimated, but then change every day, right? You just get whiplash from all that you're trying to absorb. So one of those boundaries that's really important in moments of distress like this, both to sustain ourselves through the loss of right now, because there's already enough loss right now, but also the overwhelm to our stress systems of what could be, what might be, or what will happen next, is to try to make our time and space continuum much smaller. And it also goes back to what we can and can't control. So how do I manage today sometimes even on a really hard day, how do I manage this hour? How do I manage this minute? And how do I not let myself get too caught up with 6 months from now and a year from now? Now, yes, related to our job and our lives, there are things that we need to have some anticipation and planning for, but as much as we can, if we can pull back to the immediate, to the present, to how we be present with ourselves and what's sitting inside of us now, the less we can get carried away with almost anticipatory grief, right? The grief that we're worried about we're going to feel in a month, in a week, in an hour, because that can get run away, and we can actually, talk about getting to that explosive place. It can overwhelm our bodies, our minds, our spirits. It can be too much. Jess says, I feel this, Leslie. I teach a college level. Students are holding so much. Yeah, I mean, all age groups, right? Well, when we know in psychology development, we talk about developmental trauma. Development of the brain doesn't complete until 25. So college students that have gone from high school right into college, they're in an age range in which their body and their brain is actually still functioning like a child's would, in the sense of how they absorb and can be easily overwhelmed with situations and circumstances. So imagine this on top of everything else. And then when we think about, the rituals of life, the rites of passage that we have, there's an immense grief and loss with folks who don't get to go to their college graduation, don't get to go to their high school graduation. We're expectantly awaiting their prom or their first school dance. Those things are also real losses. We may not see them at this macro level as clearly and as crystally, but there's all these little moments and all these expectations of things that were going to happen. Again, the world that we expected to happen that no longer gets to be true. And so those things also get to be grieved and have to be grieved. Monica, you said this mortician is amazing and is helping clarify what's happening around deaths in New York versus how the media is sensationalizing it. Plus, since all of her videos are super heavy, she put a picture of the hedgehog in the middle to give people a reprieve. Okay, so Monica shared something in the chat that's a YouTube video. And actually, Monica, speaking of hedgehogs, although that's an interesting segue that I didn't think I would have, I think one of the other things for us to notice and to pay attention to in this moment, the balance of grief is also joy, celebration, humor. So I think also the things that have been beautiful that have been rising up are the ways that people are counteracting grief. And in a sense, that counteraction in and of itself is a kind of ritual to process grief by creating impromptu dance parties, by creating impromptu gatherings of all different kinds that are supposed to celebrate joy and art, the free live streaming of all kinds of amazing, amazing things that we wouldn't have had access before. There's a ballet in Europe around Frida Kahlo. There was just the Octavia Butler concert slash opera by Sweet Honey in the Rock that was screened from Abu Dhabi today, which I missed most of, and I only saw the end of, so I'm a little sad about that. But there are all these ways in which the antithesis to grief, which actually isn't the opposite. It really is the way in which we are presenting ritual and process to be able to deal with our grief in real time through the things that inherently bring joy and celebration. And going back to even ancestral rituals, I talk a lot when I talk particularly about my sort of decolonizing practices of healing and restoration, is that every tribe, every tradition throughout the world had rituals that involved drumming, and dancing around fires and this ritualized process that was about music and celebration, and that was about acknowledging the presence of the moment. And in many ways, we're seeing those things rising up in our contemporary ways right now. D-Nice and Club Quarantine, which has become a huge thing where people can go. He has these, live streamed Instagram dance parties, and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, if we total it over the last weeks, have shown up to just just to participate in the act of music and collective listening and collective dance together. So those ways also that we bring joy into our moments are just as important in how we're processing grief, even when we're not doing it as a direct ritual, right? It isn't a funeral, it isn't a grief ritual in and of itself, but it is a way in which our minds, our bodies, and our spirits are processing grief in this moment. And even something as silly, right, as like, as a funny video, you know, or as something that makes us laugh. And you reminded me, Monica with the hedgehog, was that there was a video, I don't know if you all saw it, The Daily Show had actually posted it up, but it was a groundhog that had found pizza on New York City street in the garbage and was standing in front of a glass window, and there were these two large dogs behind the glass window inside the building. And the groundhog was just eating pizza, just defiantly in the faces of those dogs, kind of mocking them with its freedom and its ability to do what it wanted. But that was hilarious. There, you know, and it was just a little moment of ridiculousness and joy. There's a squirrel restaurant somebody built did wood crafting in Detroit. You know, there was a hamster art exhibit. I mean, things like this that, bizarre as they are and only cultivated in this particular moment in time we're in, have also preserved and restored and ritualized joy in a way that I think is equally critically important. Leslie says, I think the emphasis on seeing the humanity of our students and fight back against the system that aims to dehumanize them. Yeah, and I think, again, it's how do we nurture ourselves? Where's the gentleness and generosity we can offer for ourselves? Where's the gentleness and generosity that we can offer into each other in this moment that allows for the room for things to be heavy when they need to be, and allows for the space for things to be joyful when they need to be. And with the whiplash of the moment, you know, you can go from a crying spell into a dancing fit, and that's okay, you know, and that's what's needed for today. Really, the balance is, again, it goes back to how do you parcel out managing what you can right now so it doesn't become too much and overwhelming in the moment. And how do we also have expectation and understanding that there's going to be things stored away that we cannot handle right now and that we shouldn't necessarily handle right now, but that we will have to address moving forward into the future. And then Leslie says that releasing ourselves from the stigma that grief is supposed to look a certain way. Yeah, exactly. Well, and again, in this moment, we are reconceptualizing grief at a collective, communal, and individual level. It is having to look different. I think, I can't remember what city it was, but they were showing a memorial slideshow on the outside of a building in the downtown. Again, I cannot remember which city this was. It might have been Philadelphia, it might have been Boston, of folks that were lost that day, to memorialize the loss in a collective way because the gathering spaces were not possible. I've seen people post up memorial video montages that then they can share in community or watch live stream together and reflect on the life of that person. So how we hold grief in this moment has to dynamically look different for the moment in time and space that we're in. And people are finding their way, right? We're finding our way through it little by little, learning from maybe someone else in our community, learning from maybe the wisdom of our histories and our ancestries, pulling things that we can use for today and acknowledging that there are things that need to be put aside for tomorrow. Anything else anybody wants to say on video? If you want, you can turn on your microphone if you want. Okay. So there's a couple of things I just want to be able to reflect on. One of the things is primary and secondary grief. So primary and secondary grief, I think, are something that I've been thinking of in terms of this current moment. Primary grief is kind of like when we think about primary trauma or primary stress, is the thing that happens directly to us. So the impact of a loss that is personal and immediate and in our direct lived experience, the loss of a loved one, of a family member in our immediate life, loss of a job, loss of a drastic change of a life circumstance in our immediate life. And then a secondary grief, or what I'm calling secondary grief, kind of like secondary stress, is the one that is not directly experienced by us, but is experienced by those that are in our universe, in our periphery, in our lives, in our communities, that we are then holding alongside with, on behalf of them in some way, shape, or form. And the reason I mentioned secondary grief is because I think many of us, even if we're not holding primary grief around a specific loss in this moment, collectively we're all holding a kind of secondary grief. And secondary grief is more blurry and more confusing, and how we hold that becomes more blurry and more confusing. Because secondary grief, the example of that would be, that you maybe didn't immediately lose your job, but somebody that you're close with, a family or a friend, did. That you didn't immediately lose your loved one or your family member, but a friend or a colleague or community member did. And a lot of people are experiencing secondary grief right now in this moment. And it feels really hard to manage because in many ways, at least for primary grief, even though that loss has been totally disrupted, and I'll talk a little bit more about primary grief in a second and how that's been disrupted by the moment. But secondary grief is really confusing right now because it's not a direct loss that we've experienced. But at the same time, we're holding that heaviness, and it accumulates along with the heaviness that we're holding in our lives and in ourselves. But it's not a direct personal loss. And so knowing how to hold the loss that is not our own directly, but actually is felt by us in a very direct way, can be confusing in this moment. And also, I've heard of a lot of people who are holding secondary grief in this moment, feeling a lot of survivor guilt. And what I mean by that is, you didn't lose your job, but somebody else did. You didn't lose your loved one, but somebody else did that you care about. And so there can be also a kind of prioritization of whose pain is more important that we do to ourselves, in which we feel bad and guilty because that person had such an acute loss and we didn't. If you still have a job, feeling actual guilt because you still have a job, feeling guilty because you kept your job and other people at your organization, company, or whatever it is, actually lost their job when you retained it, not knowing what to do with that sense of also guilt. The fact that maybe your family member or loved one is okay while someone else that you really deeply care about has gone through this loss in this really terrible and disruptive way, that this moment has created loss really abruptly and disallowed people from grieving in the way that they would normally do. So I want to acknowledge that secondary grief is a real thing in this moment, and I'm sort of calling it secondary grief like you would call secondary trauma or secondary stress, 1 degree away from us or more. But we are actually feeling that. And I want to acknowledge for people, when you're feeling this secondary grief, that it is real, that it is authentic, that it is also still grief and loss. And it is something that we need to be able to hold and look at and be gentle with, and that it is still a vulnerability and a pain inside ourselves, even if we're holding it in a different way than the person that might have had the primary loss or the primary grief in their life. And then I also want to acknowledge that the survivor guilt is real, that you can feel bad also, because even though in these terrible circumstances and moment that we're in and how overwhelming it is, that maybe your circumstances are not as bad as someone else. Now, obviously, there's some really tangible ways in which people are embodying sort of holding what they have and others don't have, by, say, folks that are giving their stimulus check back when they don't need it into pots of money that are going to significantly more marginalized communities. But oftentimes it's not, we don't have a tangible next step of thing that we can do. And I want to acknowledge that survivor grief isn't something that we need to rectify or something that we need to fix, in the sense that it's anything that we're at fault for, whatever the circumstances are in which we feel bad because we still have something that somebody else doesn't. And maybe there are ways in which we can activate around supporting the people that do not have that loved one anymore, or do not have that resource or their needs met anymore. But also, it's important to acknowledge that it is not our fault that we are experiencing a lack of that loss. And how do we find the balance between supporting folks that have loss in this moment acknowledging the fact that we may find survivor guilt, and that even though we're feeling that, we're also experiencing our own losses that are heavy and that are strong in their own way, and not trying to navigate this sort of value system of equating or trying to evaluate one person to another, one experience to another. That can get us in a spiral where we just end up feeling really bad about feeling bad at all. We don't want to get stuck in that place, because then you're more likely to stuff down all of your feelings and not feel them because you feel like you shouldn't have them, feel like you're not worthy of them. And then actually the longer term effects are going to be more significant on how that's going to impact you if you're not actually able to acknowledge or address the feelings that you're having in this moment. The other piece I do want to acknowledge and recognize is the primary grief in this moment, in this pandemic COVID-19 moment, has been seriously disrupted by the nature of the medical crisis of COVID-19 as being the factor that is causing so much loss and death of loved ones in people's family systems. Again, going back to complicated grief, often abrupt and traumatic, unexpected, unanticipated, without folks having the ability to plan for, to prepare, to process, to preemptively grieve for anything. It is very acute and very traumatic. And then on top of that, the experience of the grief and loss of the moment in this medical crisis, in which family members are not able to even say goodbye in the moment of the loss of that person or leading up to the loss of that person, due to all the medical measures that are necessary to disrupt the increased infection rate. So you have both. You have the family members who are unable to say goodbye to loved ones in ways that they would have wanted to, that at best, and this is not even true for everyone, but at best, they get to do it over a Zoom call or over the telephone, or over a conference call, in ways that don't, when we think about ourselves as very sensory beings and we experience loss in a very sensory way, and also our recognition that loss is real is also very tactile. The seeing and the experiencing and the feeling of the loss of that person makes it very real and allows our body and mind to process it in a very particular way. When we're at a distance and absent from all of that engagement with the process of loss of a human being, it can be so disorienting and so painful, and also really disrupt the natural grieving process that a person is supposed to have in the best of circumstances, in the best of times. And then the other kind of unintended consequence of this medical moment is that we're having this grief by proxy of frontline medical workers who are now becoming essentially the grief doulas for an entire collective of people that are dying in this moment, who are without their loved ones, who are isolated in spaces and places that are scary because of the nature of the medical response that's needed. And you have these proxy death doulas of people that are not the family members, but are saying the goodbyes, are spending the final moments with tons, maybe 15 people in a day, maybe 100 people in a week. They're doing the grief and loss process by proxy for all of these families and loved ones. And that also has its own toll, because you have people grieving, multiple people in any given day, by the nature of their job in this moment as doctors and nurses, also in positions in which normally they're able to prevent or at least do some intervention to halt the loss and death of life. And because we don't have a vaccine, because we don't have treatment mechanisms, the very way in which they're able to function to do the thing that they do best to preserve life, they are not able to do. And simultaneously, a thing that they were not equipped to do or trained to do or ever expected to have to do in this kind of mass way, being these proxy death doulas, they are now having to take on this role that is not just about a job, that is also penetrating their own emotional life, their own soul, their own bodies in deeply traumatic and grieving ways. And so how do we also consider how are we holding just the knowledge of all of these complicated ways in which we're holding grief. The secondary grief that we're not experiencing directly, but we are all in some way holding proxy grief for so much loss in this moment. How folks that that should be able to have the grief and loss process for their loved ones are having to do it removed and at a distance without the rituals and practices even that would normally be at their disposal. And then these death doulas, frontline workers that are having to be the proxy grievers for entire communities, entire hospitals full of people day in and day out, who are sitting with folks at a level and a scale that they never could have imagined, and being the only person there through the last moments of their lives. And what do we think about in terms of how are we going to nurture the grief and loss in all of these different ways for the longer term? So thinking beyond just this moment, also thinking about what is the process of grief when we look at it in the narrative of coronavirus? Because we have to manage the pockets and the pieces that we can right now. But for folks, especially feeling the most acute elements of this crisis, there's going to be only a small amount that can be processed and addressed and even acknowledged where it is, what it is, how does it feel, what is the extent of it? And then how do we think about the narrative of grief over a longer term continuum? What is the grief work we need to do right now, which has a kind of triage quality to it? How do I just process the feelings in my body? How do I regulate the stress of it? How do I create a boundary set so that I'm not over absorbing the amount of information that I can in any given day that will overwhelm my system and that will be an overabundance of grief beyond what I can handle? How do I manage that in the short term? How do I imagine the grief process and the rituals that we're formulating as we go in terms of grieving people in our communities, our loved ones, those that we're having to acknowledge both the loss of life and the loss of a kind of way of life, right? Financially, jobs, the kind of impact of that. And how do we imagine grief in a longer term where we're going to have this built up, stored up grief? It's going to be collective and individual. It's going to be specific for people that have specific personal primary losses, for people that have secondary losses, and for people that are frontline workers that have proxy loss that we've never equipped people to deal with. What is the long-term impact and what is the long-term response that we want to build towards? So hopefully part of that also can be a hopeful and an aspirational thing, is not just this is a thing and it's true, but if we know this thing to be true, that there are these processes and phases of grief within this current context that we find ourselves in, how do we equip ourselves, our communities, and those that are most exposed to this pain and suffering for a longer term process of grief and loss? And also, how do we hold that gentleness and generosity now and forward for the fact that none of these things are simple fixes, that none of these things are short term, and that grief and loss in the best of times is a longer term process. Complicated grief becomes a longer term process because of so many of the ways that the natural grieving process is stunted. But how do we have the gentleness for the pace and the time and the breadth of this loss? And how do we begin to fashion and imagine and figure the new rituals that we're going to need moving into a new landscape? And like I said, some of the ways in which people are erupting spaces of joy and spaces of celebration are already in some ways mediating grief and pain in this moment, and creating collective rituals that we get to participate in ways that we hadn't even imagined yet. So it's already happening at some level. I want to pause there, take a few more deep breaths together. So let's take a big deep inhale in and a big deep exhale out. Another big deep inhale in. Another big deep exhale out. One more big deep inhale in. And big deep exhale out. And then I have a ritual for closing and some announcements I want to get to in just a little bit. But before I go there, I want to open space for any questions or reflections people have, either in the chat or if you want to turn your microphones on. leave some space here, just a pause. If you have anything you want to lift up, ask, reflect. And if you have anything you want to share in relationship to your own practices in this moment that are holding space for your own heaviness. BJ says, I work with youth and it can be really difficult to hold all their feelings of anxiety during this time. Do you have any advice? Yeah, that is, again, it's not easy because in that developmental space in our life, we are more easily overwhelmed and we're more sensitized to our environment just naturally. And so they are likely absorbing the stress and anxiety, not just of themselves, but their entire family system, all the people surrounding them, and just the sort of crisis nature of the moment. I think it's really, really hard to know how to support them well. I do want to say that I think the ability to offer them any kind of grounding practices and tools as part of the educational process can be helpful. Kids maybe don't want to sit and do breathing or do restful practices for too long, but you could do a simple practice that allows them to take those deep breaths together, even 3 deep breaths, at the beginning of a lesson or a few times throughout can be something very simple. Moments where they get to stretch together, move their bodies a little bit. Any kind of tools and resources that you can build into the curriculum that actually provide a supportive environment for people to have space to hold those things without needing answers to them, because many things don't have answers. Just a way to kind of process it at a very sensory level can be helpful. There's an organization called Contemplative Mind in Higher Ed. And although it's meant for college age application, there's actually some useful tools and webinars they have over there and courses and things like that. A lot of free materials that are about bringing a contemplative framework into a classroom context. So there could be some also very interesting tools over there about how they bring them at least into there are definitely things in their materials that you can translate for any kind of level of educational setting. BJ, you also said it's especially a challenge because I'm currently experiencing my own grief, both due to the virus and lack of ability to be with loved ones, but also the recent loss of a parent. And I think also thank you for sharing that and being really transparent about what you're going through. And that's also the complexity of grief in this moment, is it's layered between, particularly again, if you're in a healing or in a helping profession, an educator, a therapist, a nurse, a doctor, whatever it is, you may be holding all of your own stuff and you're trying to hold the pain, struggles, and suffering for your students. And so I would say finding ways that you can do it, again, with those boundaries. And the boundaries, what I mean by that when we're thinking about being an educator or being a healing provider, is that you find ways that you can offer tools that are simple, right? Maybe a few practices that you bring into the classroom and that you support them. And then of course you do your best to make sure that they're able to succeed and take care of themselves in this moment. And also you give yourself space for your own downtime. You give yourself space for the things that you need to feel for yourself, and allow yourself the permission to take space for what you need. Because again, we cannot nurture and take care of those people. There's the example of putting the oxygen mask on yourself before you can put it on someone else, or else you won't be able to do the assistance for the second person. Very appropriate in the moment that we're in. But we have to nurture and be gentle and generous with ourselves so that we can take care of the people in our world sphere, whether that's students, whether that's clients, as healing providers, whatever it is, we have to take care of ourselves as well. So it can be very hard to set boundaries in triage mode and in crisis mode because there are so many needs that everyone else has, and particularly students are so vulnerable that we want to give everything, but you have to give enough to yourself as well so that you can be preserved for what you need in the output to actually support and to continue supporting them. Because both for ourselves, for our communities, for students, for clients, the moment of grief is not just now. There's a narrative arc over a period of time. So how do we sustain ourselves for today, so that we can help those people we're helping into tomorrow as well. So nurture and be gentle and generous with your own pain and struggles too. Thank you for that. Kaia also said that in response to BJ's comment, she wanted to share a resource that she found today in case it's helpful in your work with kiddos. Great, so wonderful. Please do share that, Kaia, that would be great. Also, okay, so I want to close with a practice in a moment, but before, and I'd like to finish with the practice. So I want to offer, since we're doing tools and resources, I'm going to share a few things into the chat for folks to have. The first one is my link tree, which is Linktree/Teresa, Teresa, Mateus, MateuschI. And that link tree has links to all kinds of things. So it's an easy, quick reference point for folks to be able to have to access other resources, both within the track programming right now and upcoming. So what you'll find listed in there is we have 2 upcoming webinars that are going to be following this one. One is going to be next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time. And that one is called Rooting into Ritual. And that's going to be with Kittist Ashe. Kittist is one of the care providers on the track care team. And then Kittist is going to be doing a second offering the following Tuesday, also at 6 p.m. Central Time, which is going to be Tender Loving Care. And that's going to be specifically about plant-based practices and tools and resources to deal with pain and stress in this moment. And the first one, Rooting into Ritual, is about offering, I think it's a really good follow-up to this grief and loss webinar, because it's going to talk about how do we find the rituals and the resources for rituals that we need for this moment. And again, the second one that's going to be in 2 weeks, Tender Loving Care, is going to be about plant-based resources for pain. So both of those I think are going to be really helpful follow-ups, offering additional tools and resources. Also, I want to remind folks, or let you know for the first time, if you haven't heard this from me on other webinars before, that included in the link tree is all of our track resources. So on track, we have a COVID-19 care page, which includes an entire resource guide that we try to update weekly with different free offerings that are out there and resources and organizations that are offering good stuff in this moment. And that continues to expand. So we continue to expand the listing as we can. Also on that track COVID care page, we have a link to our one-on-one virtual care and support. So that's kind of a bridge hotline type support that we're offering in this moment, really trying to center having a listening ear and grounding space for folks that may be struggling through this crisis moment. And really on any given day, that could be any of us. So it's perfectly normal to be feeling overwhelmed. And if you need support, we are providing this one-on-one care. Also in my link tree is the link directly to the one-on-one care form. So you just fill out that form, either find it on the track website, or you can find it on the just through my link tree in the one-on-one care form. And then you can request care and support. We'll get back to you within a day and pair you up with somebody from our volunteer care team. And they will be able to provide 3 no-cost sessions, supportive sessions as you need it. And yes, and also all of my information and all my resources are also in the link tree. You can also find me at teresamateus.com, where I have all of sort of my stuff connected and then linked back to track as well. So that I think is all of my spiel for now. So hopefully this has been helpful and useful. It was meant to be a grounding space just to give some kind of frameworks to what grief looks like right now, just some kind of base of knowledge and understanding. I really feel around emotional dimensions of ourselves and in crisis, that information can be so powerfully important and empowering for us. So we can feel like there is something we can control in a moment that feels so uncontrollable. And hopefully the other track resources may be of use to you. Again, the upcoming webinars that we'll be hosting and additionally our one-on-one care and support. You can also find us at Track for Movements on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where we're constantly updating information about our resources. Additionally, starting next week, we also will be having a self-compassion group that will be a support group that will be facilitated by two of our community care team members, rotating team of two of our community care members each week. And that information also will be posted up shortly in my link tree and will also be up on all of our social media platforms. So for closing, I'd like us just to be able to do a little bit of that grounding again. I also want to acknowledge that talking about trauma, stress, crisis, and grief can always be triggering for us. And in this moment, since we're already at heightened stress alert, even more so. So I just want to acknowledge that and offer up permission, not that you need it, but to be gentle and generous with yourself, but really to kind of notice whatever might show up throughout the rest of your night, throughout your day tomorrow, and be especially gentle with yourself if and as things might show up. Find ways that you can ground and center for yourself, knowing that when we talk about these things, we feel them in our bodies, and it can cause a sense of kind of disruption. And so just want to pay attention to that and take care of ourselves. So we're going to close again with just a small grounding practice. So if you just want to get comfortable wherever you are and relax into your chair or on the floor, on your bed, or wherever you are in this moment, noticing whatever you're resting on, noticing the tactile feeling and sensation, whatever is under your body, whatever is under your feet. Is it a cushion? Is it soft? Is it a chair? Is it hard? Just notice whatever is holding you up and grounding you in this moment in a very physical, visceral way. And just allowing your body to relax even just a little bit with the acknowledgement the chair, the ground, the couch, or the bed will hold you up, and that you can relax yourself into this moment. Bringing your focus and attention back in on your breath. Noticing again the length of your inhales and the length of your exhales. Allowing yourself to relax even just a little bit. Allow your breathing to slow and steady. Begin to take big, deep inhales in. So on every inhale, you can fill your belly, ribs, and chest fill with oxygen, like a balloon filling up. And on every exhale, imagine pulling your belly in towards your spine so that you can really release all of the oxygen from your lungs. On your inhale, breathing in, belly, ribs, and chest filling with oxygen. And big deep exhale out, releasing and letting go, letting go, letting go. Another big deep inhale in, breathing into the muscles of your body, breathing into the places of tension. And exhale, release and let go, whatever is possible. Relax and be present with whatever remains. Finding your own slow and steady rhythm of breath, releasing what is possible, acknowledging and resting in what remains. Noticing again wherever you feel heaviness in your body, just acknowledging its presence without judgment or criticism. And at the center of that place where you feel the heaviness most in your body, imagine a slowly growing ball of warmth and light. Imagine on each and every breath, that ball of warmth and light expanding just a little bit. So that every inhale grows a little bit more. And on every exhale, you can acknowledge the warmth as it moves wider and wider. out from the center of that space where you hold the most heaviness. Allow it to be surrounded and filled with this warmth and light, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. Imagine that warmth and light beginning to grow and expand, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. Imagine in every breath, the warmth growing outward, the light expanding, until you can feel it move out from its center, beginning to stretch all throughout your body, acknowledging that the heaviness remains, but also acknowledging the presence of the warmth and the light, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. With every breath, it expands, it warms, until you can feel it from the center of your chest, out through your limbs, to your fingers and your toes, up through the crown of your head, and moving even beyond your physical self. So you can feel it like a pulse, like a heartbeat, expanding out from yourself into whatever surrounds you. Knowing the heaviness remains, acknowledging it with gentle generosity, but also acknowledging the presence of the warmth and the light, and allowing that also to hold space, that we don't have to pick between one or the other, that we can hold the grief and the heaviness. We can hold the warmth and the light and the possibility, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. Then allow yourself to hold on to the felt memory, the warmth and the light, knowing that it can always return back whenever you need it, that you can always bring your focus back in on the presence of the warmth and the light whenever you need it. You can always find the grounding in your inhales and your exhales. And then as you're ready, you can slowly bring some energy back into the muscles of your body again, maybe wiggling your fingers and your toes, maybe shaking your head gently from side to side if it's comfortable. And then as you're ready, slowly open your eyes if they were closed. So thank you everyone for joining this evening. Can't believe I was actually timely. Again, you can join us on social media to find all the updates of our programming and our content as they come. Track for Movements, number 4 in the middle, so TRACC 4 Movements on all social media. You can find us on our website, and if you pulled from my link tree, you can find all the resource links for all of the track sources as well as on our website. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Be gentle and generous. Have a calming, relaxing, soothing evening, whatever that looks like for you. And hopefully we'll see some of you for our next webinar next week. Have a good night.
Thank you so